Welcome to Miss Retro Reads, continuing with Letters of a Woman Homesteader, Chapter 8, A Happy Christmas. Dear Mrs. Coney, my happy Christmas resulted from the ex-sheriff of this county being snowbound here. It seems that persons who come from a lower altitude to this country frequently become bewildered, especially if in poor health, leave the train at any stop and wander off into the hills, sometimes dying before they are found. The ex-sheriff cited a case that a young German who was returned from the Philippines, where he had been discharged after the war. He was the only child of his widowed mother, who has a ranch a few miles from here. No one knew he was coming home. One day the cook, belonging to the camp of construction gang, went hunting and came back running, wild with horror. He had found the body of a man. The coroner and the sheriff were notified, and next morning went out for the body, but the wolves had almost destroyed it. High up in a willow under which the poor man had lain down to die, they saw a small bundle tied in a red bandana and fast to a branch. They found a letter addressed to whoever should find it, saying that the body was that of Benny Louderer, and giving them directions how to spare his poor mother the awful knowledge of how he died. Also there was a letter to his mother asking her not to grieve for him and to keep their days faithfully. Their days, I afterwards learned, were anniversaries which they had always kept, to which was added Benny's Day. Poor boy! When he realized that death was near, his every thought was for his mother. Well, they followed his wishes, and the casket containing the bare, gnarled bones was sealed and never opened. And to this day poor Mrs. Louderer thinks her boy died of some fever while yet abroad, and transported. The manner of his death has been kept a secret, that I am the only one who has heard of it. I was so sorry for the poor mother that I resolved to visit her and the first opportunity. I am at liberty to go where I please when there is no one to cook for. So, when the men left, a few days later, I took Jerrine and rode over to the Louderer ranch. I had never seen Mrs. Louderer, and it happened to be Benny's Day that I blundered in upon. I found her to be a dear old German woman living all alone, and the people who do work on the ranch living in another house 2 miles away. She had been weeping for hours when I got there, but in accordance with her custom, on the many anniversaries she had a real feast prepared, although no one had been bidden. She says that God always sends her guests, but that was the first time she had had a little girl. She had a little daughter once herself, little Gretchen, but all that was left was a sweet memory and a pitifully small mound on the ranch, quite near the house, where Benny and Gretchen are at rest beside their father, Herr Louderer. She is such a dear old lady. She made us so welcome, and she is so entertaining. All the remainder of the day was listened to the stories of her children, looked at her pictures, and Jerrine had a lovely time with a wonderful wooden doll that they had brought with them from Germany. Mrs. Louderer forgot to weep in recalling her childhood days and showing us her treasures, and then our feast, for it was verily a feast. We had goose, and it was so delicious. I couldn't tell you half the good things any more than I could have eaten some of all of them. We sat talking until far into the night. She asked me how I was going to spend Christmas. I told her probably in being homesick. She said that that would never do and suggested that we spend it together. She said it was one of their special days and that the only happiness left her was in making some one else happy. So she had thought of cooking some nice things and going to as many sheep camps as she could, taking with her the good things to the poor exiles, the sheep herders. I liked the plan and was glad to agree, but I never dreamt that I should have so lovely a time. When the odd old wooden clock announced 2, we went to bed. I left quite early the next morning with my head full of Christmas plans. You may not know, but cattlemen and sheepmen cordially hate each other. Mr. Stewart is a cattleman, and so I didn't mention my Christmas plans to him. I saved all the butter I could spare, for the sheep herders, they never have any. That and some jars of gooseberry jelly was all I could give them. I cooked plenty for the people here, and 2 days before Christmas I had a chance to go down to Mrs. Louderer's in a buggy. So we went. We found her up to her ears in cooking, and such sights and smells I could never describe. She was so glad I came early, for she needed help. I never worked so hard in my life or had a pleasanter time. Mrs. Louderer had sent a man out several days before to find out how many camps there were and where they were located. There were 12 camps, and that means 24 men. We roasted 6 geese, boiled 3 small hams, and 3 hens. We had besides several meatloaves and links of sausage. We had 12 large loaves of best rye bread, a small tub of doughnuts, 12 coffee cakes, more to be called fruit cakes, and also a quantity of little cakes with seeds and nuts and fruit in them. So pretty to look at and so good to taste. These had a thick coating of icing, some brown, some pink, some white. I had 13 pounds of butter and 6-pint jars of jelly. So we melted the jelly and poured it into 12 glasses. The plan was to start really early Christmas Eve morning, make our circuit of camps, and wind up the day at Frau O'Shaughnessy's to spend the night. Yes, Mrs. O'Shaughnessy is Irish as the pigs in Dublin. Before it was day, the men came to feed and to get their horses ready. We were up betimes and had breakfast. The last speck was wiped from the shining stove, the kitchen floor was scrubbed, and the last small thing put in order. The men had 4 horses harnessed and hitched to the sled, on which was placed a wagon box filled with straw, hot rocks, and blankets. For 12 apostles, that is what we called our 12 boxes, were lifted in and tied firmly into place. Then we climbed in, and away we went. Mrs. Louderer drove, and Sam O'Shanter and Paul Revere were snails compared to us. We didn't follow any road either, but went sweeping along cross-country. No one else in the world could have done it unless they were drunk. We were careening along hillsides, without even slackening the trot. Occasionally we struck a particularly stubborn bunch of sagebrush, and even the sled runners would jump up into the air. We didn't stop to light, but hit the earth several feet in advance of where we left it. Luck was with us, though. I hardly expected to get through with my head unbroken, but not even a glass was cracked. It would have done your heart good to see the sheepmen. They were all delighted. And when you consider that they live solely on canned corn and tomatoes, beans, salt pork, and coffee, you can fancy what they thought of their treats. They have mutton when it is fit to eat, but that is certainly not in winter. One man at each camp does the cooking, and the other herds. It doesn't make any difference if the cook never cooked before, and most of them never did. At one camp, where we stopped for dinner, they had a most interesting collection of fossils. After delivering our last apostle, we turned our faces towards Frau O'Shaughnessy's and got there just in time for supper. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy is a widow too, and has quite an interesting story. She is a dumpy little woman whose small nose seems to be smelling the stars. It is so tip-tilted. She has the merriest blue eyes and the quickest wit. It is really worth a severe bumping just to be welcomed by her. It was so warm and cozy in her low little cabin. She had her table set for supper, But she laid plates for us and put before us a beautifully roasted chicken. Thrifty Mrs. Louderer thought it should have been saved until next day, so she said to Frau O'Shaughnessy, "We hate to eat your hen, but you save her till tomorrow." But Mrs. O'Shaughnessy answered, "Oh, 'tis is no matter, 'tis is an auld hen she was anyway." So we enjoyed the auld hen, which was brown, juicy, and tender. Before we left the table, someone knocked, and a young man, a sheepherder, entered. He belonged to a camp a few miles away, and is out from Boston in search of health. He had been into town, and his horse was lamed, so he could not make it into camp, and he wanted to stay overnight. He was a stranger to us all, but Mrs. O'Shaughnessy made him at home, and fixed such a tempting supper for him that I am sure he was glad of the chance to stay. He was very decidedly English, and powerfully proud of it. He asked Mrs. O'Shaughnessy if she was Irish, and she said, "No, it's Chinese I am. Can't yez tell by me Cockney accent?" Mr. Boutwell looked very much surprised. I don't know which was the funnier, the way he looked or what she said. We had a late breakfast Christmas morning, but before we were through, Mr. Stewart came. He had planned to spend the day at Mrs. O'Shaughnessy's, but he didn't approve of our going into the sheep district, so when he found where we had gone, he came after us. Mrs. Louderer and he are old acquaintances, and he bosses her around like he tries to boss me. Before we left, Mrs. O'Shaughnessy's married daughter came, so we knew she would not be lonely. It was almost 1 o'clock when we got home, but all hands helped, and I had plenty cooked anyway, so we soon had a good dinner on the table. Mr. Stewart had prepared a Christmas box for Jerrine and me. He doesn't approve of white waists in winter. I had worn one at the wedding, and he felt personally aggrieved. For me, in a box were 2 dresses, that is, the material to make them. One is a brown and red checked, and the other green with a white fleck in it, both outing flannel. For Jerrine there was a pair of shoes and stockings, both stockings full of candy and nuts. He is very bluff in manner, but he is really the kindest person. Mrs. Louderer stayed until New Year's Day. My Christmas was really a very happy one. Your friend, Eleanor Rupert. P.S. An interesting day on this ranch is the day the cattle are named. If Mr. Stewart had children, he would as soon think of leaving them unnamed as to let a beastie go without a name. On the day they vaccinated, he came in the kitchen and told me he would need me to help him name the critters. So he and I assembled in a safe place and took turns naming the calf. As fast as a calf was vaccinated, it was run out of the chute, and he or I called out a name for it, and it was booked that way. The first 2 he named were Duke of Monmouth and the Duke of Montrose. I called my first Oliver Cromwell and John Fox. The poor Mon had to have revenge, so the poor little scrawny beast he called the Pope of Rome, and it was a heifer calf too. This morning I had the startling news that the Pope had eaten too much alfalfa and was all swelt up, and moreover he had swelted, and I don't know which is the more astonishing, that the Pope had stolen alfalfa or that he has eaten it. We have a swell lot of names, but I am not sure I could tell you which is Bloody Mary, or which is Elizabeth, or indeed which is which of any of them. E.R. Chapter 9. A Confession. April 5th, 1910. Dear Mrs. Coney, I find upon rereading your letter that I did not answer it at all when I wrote you. You must think me very indifferent, but I really don't mean to be. My house joins on to Mr. Stewart's house. It was built that way so that I could hold down my land and job at the same time. I see the wisdom of it now, though at first I did not want it that way. My boundary lines run within 2 feet of Mr. Stewart's house, so it was quite easy to build on. I think the Patterson's ranch is about 25 miles from us. I am glad to tell you they are doing splendidly. Gail is just as thrifty as she can be, and Bobby is steady and making money fast. Their baby is the dearest little thing. I have heard that Sedalia is to marry a Mormon bishop, but I doubt it. She puts on very distinguished airs about our Bobby, and she patronizes Gail most shamefully. But Gail, bless her unconscious heart, is so happy in her husband and son that she doesn't know Sedalia is insulting. My dear old grandmother, whom I loved so much, has gone home to God. I used to write long letters to her. I should like a few addresses of old persons who are lonely as she was, who would like letters such as I write. You know I can't be brief. I have tried and cannot. If you know of any persons who would not tire of my long accounts and would care to have them, you will be doing me a favor to let me know. I have not treated you quite frankly about something you had a right to know about. I am ashamed. I have regret very much that I have not told you. I so dread the possibility of losing your friendship that I will never tell you unless you promise me beforehand to forgive me. I know that is unfair, but it is the only way I can see out of a difficulty that my foolish reticence has led me into. Few people perhaps consider me reticent, but in some cases I am afraid I am even deceitful. Won't you make it easy to fess so I may be happy again? Truly your friend, Eleanor Rupert. June 16th, 1910. My dear friend, your card just to hand. I wrote you some time ago telling you I had a confession to make and have had no letter since, so thought perhaps you were scared I had done something too bad to forgive. I am suffering just now from eye strain and can't see to write long at a time, but I reckon I had better confess and get it done with. The thing I have done is to marry Mr. Stewart. It was such an inconsistent thing to do that I was ashamed to tell you. And, too, I was afraid you would think I didn't need your friendship and might desert me. Another of my friends thinks that way. I hope my eyes will be better soon, and then I will write you a long letter. Your old friend with a new name, Eleanor Stewart. Chapter 10. Zebby's Story. September 1st, 1910. Dear Mrs. Coney, it was just a few days after the birthday party, and Mrs. O'Shaughnessy was with me again. We were down at the barn looking at some new pigs when we heard the big corral gate swing shut, so we hastened out to see who it could be so late in the day. It was Zebby. He had come on the stage to Burnt Fork, and the driver had brought him on here. There was so much to tell, and he whispered he had something to tell me privately, but that he was too tired then, so after supper I hustled him off to bed. Next morning the men went off to their work, and Zebby and I were left to tell secrets. When he was sure we were alone, he took from his trunk a long, flat box. Inside was the most wonderful shirt I have ever seen. It looked like a cross between a nightshirt and a shirtwaist. It was of homespun linen. The bosom was ruffled and tucked, all done by hand. Such tiny stitches, such patience and skill. Then he handed me an old daguerreotype. I unfastened the little golden hook, and inside was a face good to see and to remember. It was dim, yet clear in outline, just as if she were looking out from the mellow twilight of long ago. The sweet, elusive smile. I couldn't tell where it was, whether it was the mouth or the beautiful eyes that were smiling. All that was visible of her dress was the Dutch collar, just like what is being worn now. It was pinned with an ugly old brooch, which Zebby said was a breastpin. He had given it to her. Under the glass on the other side was a strand of faded hair and a slip of paper. The writing on the paper was so faded it was scarcely readable, but it said, Pauline Gorley, age 22, 1860. Next he showed me a note written by Pauline, simply worded, but it held a world of meaning for Zebby. It said, I spun and wove this cloth at Adeline's, enough for me a dress and you a shirt, which I made. It is for the wedding, else to be buried in. Yours, Pauline. The shirt, the picture, and the note had waited for him all these years in Mothy's care, and now I will tell you the story. Long, long ago, someone did something to someone else and started a feud. Unfortunately, the Gorleys were on one side and the Parkers on the other. That it all happened before either Zebby or Pauline were born was no difference. A Gorley must hate a Parker always, as always a Parker must hate a Gorley. Pauline was the only girl, and she had a regiment of big brothers who gloried in the warfare and wanted only the slightest pretext to shoot a Parker. So they grew up, and Zebby often met Pauline at the quiltings and other gatherings at the homes of non-partisans. He remembers her so perfectly and describes her so plainly that I can picture her easily. She had brown eyes and hair. She used to ride about on her sorrel palfrey. She wore a pink calico sunbonnet, and Zebby says she was just like the pink hollyhocks that grew by her mother's window. Isn't that a sweet picture? Her mother and the father were both dead, and she and her brothers lived on their plantation. Zebby had never dared speak to her until one day he had driven over with his mother and sisters to a dinner given on a neighboring plantation. He was standing outside near the wall, when someone dropped a spray of apple blossoms down upon him from an upper window. He looked up, and Pauline was leaning out smiling at him. After that, he made a point to frequent places where he might expect her. She was a loyal little soul, and would not desert, although he urged her to, even promising her to go away, plumb away clean to Scott County if she would go. She told him that her brothers would go even as far as that to kill him, so that they must wait and hope. Finally, Zebby got tired of waiting, and one day he boldly rode up to the Gorley home and formally asked for Pauline's hand. The bullet he got for his presumption kept him from going to war with his father and brother when they marched away. Some time later, George Gorley was shot and killed from ambush, and although Zebby had not yet left his bed, the Gorleys believed he did it. And one night Pauline came through a heavy rainstorm with only Caesar to warn Zebby and to beg him for her sake to get away as fast as he could that night. She pleaded that she could not live if he were killed, and could never marry him if he killed her brothers, so she persuaded him to go while they were all innocent. Well, he did as she wished, and they never saw each other again. He never went home again until last Thanksgiving, and dear little Pauline had been dead for years. She herself had taken her little gifts for Zebby to Mothy to keep for him. Some years later she died and was buried in the dress she mentioned. It was woven at Adeline Carter's, one of the bitterest enemies of the Gorleys, but the sacrifice of her pride did her no good because she was long at rest before Zebby knew. He had been greatly grieved because no stone marked her grave, only a tangle of rose-briars. So he bought a stone, and in the night before Decoration Day, he and two of Uncle Buck's grandsons went to the Gorley burying ground and raised it to the memory of sweet Pauline. Some of the Gorleys still lived there, so he came home at once, fearing if they should find out who placed the stone above their sister, they would take vengeance on his poor frail body. After he had finished telling me his story, I felt just as I used to when grandmother opened the big chest to air her wedding clothes and the dress each of her babies wore when baptized. It seemed almost like smelling the lavender and rose leaves, and it was with reverent fingers that I folded the shirt and the work of love yellow with age and laid it in the box. Well, Mrs. O'Shanassy returned, and early one morning we started with a wagon and a bulging mess box for Zebby's home. We were going a new and longer route in order to take the wagon. Dandelions spread a carpet of gold, larkspurs grew waist-high with its long spikes of blue. The service bushes and the wild cherries were a mass of white beauty. Meadowlarks and robins and bluebirds twittered and sang from every branch, it almost seemed. A sky of tenderest blue bent over us, and fleecy little clouds drifted lazily across. Soon we came to the pineries, where we traveled up deep gorges and canyons. The sun shot arrows of gold through the pines down upon us, and we gathered our arms full of columbines. The little black squirrels barked and chattered saucily as we passed along, and we were all children together. We forgot all about feuds and partings, death and hard times. We all remembered was that God is good and the world is wide and beautiful. We plodded along all day. Next morning, there was a blue haze that Zebby said meant there would be a high wind, so we hurried to reach his home that evening. The sun was hanging like a great red ball in the smoky haze when we entered the long canyon in which is Zebby's cabin. Already it was dusky in the canyons below, but not a breath of air stirred. A more delightful man than Zebby I never saw when he finally drove up to his low, comfortable cabin. Smoke was slowly rising from the chimney, and Gabbett, the man in charge, rushed out. Of the hounds set up a joyful bark. Gabbett is a Frenchman, and he was all smiles as he said, "Welcome, welcome. Today I rejoice you have come. Yesterday I am despair if you have come because I am scrub. But today, behold, I am delight." I have heard of clean people, but Gabbett is the cleanest man I ever saw. The cabin floor was so white I hated to step on it. The windows shone, and at each there was a calico curtain, blue and white check, unironed but newly washed. In one window was an old brown pitcher, cracked and nicked, filled with thistles. I never thought them pretty before, but the pearly pink and the silvery green were so pretty and looked so clean that they had a new beauty. Above the fireplace was a great black eagle which Gabbett had killed, and the wings outspread, and a bunch of arrows in the claws. In one corner near the fire was a washstand, and behind it hung the fishing tackle. Above one door was a gun rack, on which lay the rifle and shotgun, and over the other door was a pair of deer antlers. In the center of the room stood the square, homemade table, every inch scrubbed. In the side room, which is the bedroom, was a wide bunk made of pine plank that had also been scrubbed, then filled with fresh sweet pine boughs, and over them was spread a piece of canvas that had once been a wagon sheet, but Gabbett had washed it and boiled and pounded it until it was clean and sweet. That served for a sheet. Zebby was beside himself with joy. The hounds sprang upon him and expressed their joy unmistakably. He went at once to the corrals to see the critters, and every one of them was safely penned for the night. Old Sim, an old ram, goodness knows how old, promptly butted him over, but he just beamed with pleasure. "Sim knows me, danged if he don't," was his happy exclamation. We went into the cabin and left him petting the critters. Gabbett did himself proud getting supper. We had trout and most delicious biscuits. Each of us had a crisp, tender head of lettuce with a spoonful of potato salad in the center. We had preserves made from canned peaches and the firmest yellow butter. Soon it was quite dark, and we had a tiny brass lamp, which gave but a feeble light, but it was quite cool, so we had a blaze fire, which made it light enough. When supper was over, Zebby called us out and asked us if we could hear anything. We could hear the most peculiar long-drawn, sighing wail, and steadily grew louder and nearer. I was really frightened, but he said it was the forerunner of the windstorm that would soon strike us. He said it was wind coming from Crag Canyon, and in just a few minutes it struck us like a cold wave and rushed, sighing, on down the canyon. We could hear it after it had passed us, and it was perfectly still round the cabin. Soon we heard the deep roaring of the coming storm, and Zebby called the hounds in and secured the door. The sparks began to fly in the chimney. Jerrine lay on a bearskin before the fire, and Mrs. O'Shanassy and I sat on the old blue settle at one side. Gabbett lay on the other side of the fire on the floor, his hands under his head. Zebby got out his beloved old fiddle and tuned up and began playing. Outside the storm was raging, growing worse all the time. Zebby played and played. The worse the tumult, the harder the storm, and the harder he played. I remember I was holding my breath, expecting the house to be blown away every moment, and Zebby was playing what he called Bonaparte's Retreat. It all seemed to flash before me. I could see those poor suffering soldiers staggering along in the snow, sacrifices to one man's unholy ambitions. I verily believe we were all bewitched. I shouldn't have been surprised to have seen witches and gnomes come tumbling down the chimney or flying in at the door, riding on the chest of the storm. I glanced at Mrs. O'Shanassy. She sat with her chin in her hand, gazing with unseeing eyes into the fire. Zebby seemed possessed. He couldn't tire. It seemed like hours had passed, and the tumult had not diminished. I felt like shrieking, but I gathered Jerrine up into my arms and carried her into bed. Mrs. O'Shanassy came with us. She touched my elbow and said, "Child, don't look towards the window. The banshees are out tonight." We knelt together beside the bed and said our beads. Then, without undressing, save pulling off our shoes, we crawled under our blankets and lay on the sweet, clean pine. We were both perfectly worn out, but we could not sleep. There seemed to be hundreds of different noises of the storm, for there are so many canyons, so many crooks and turns, and great forests too. The wind was shrieking and howling and roaring all at once. A deep boom announced the fall of some giant tree in the forest. I finally dozed off even in that terrible din. But Zebby was not so frenzied as he had been. He was playing Annie Laurie, and that song has always been a favorite of mine. The storm began gradually to die away, and Annie Laurie sounded so beautiful. I was thinking of Pauline, and I know, too, Zebby. Annie Laurie and Pauline Gorley are one and the same. I knew no more until I heard Zebby call out, "Ho, you sleepy heads, it's day." Mrs. O'Shanassy turned over and said she was still sleepy. My former visit had taught me what beauty an early morning would spread before me, so I dressed hastily and went outdoors. Zebby called me to go for a little walk. The amber light of the new day was chasing the violet and amethyst shadows down the canyons. It was all more beautiful than I can tell you. On one side, the canyon wall was almost straight up. It looked as if we might step off into a very world of mountains. Soon old Baldy wore a crown of gleaming gold. The sun was up. We walked on and soon came to a brook. We were washing our faces in its icy waters when we heard twigs breaking, so we stood perfectly still. From out the undergrowth of birch and willow came a deer with 2 fawns. They stopped to drink and nibbled the bushes. But soon they scented strangers, and looking about with their beautiful startled eyes, they saw us, and away they went like the wind. We saw many great trees uptorn by the storm. High up on the cliffs, Zebby showed me where the eagles built every year. We turned homeward and sat down upon the trunk of a fallen pine to rest and take another look at the magnificent view. Zebby was silent, but presently he threw a handful of pebbles down the canyon wall. I am not sorry Pauline is dead. I have never shed a tear. I know you think that is odd, but I have never wanted to mourn. I am glad that it is as it is. I am happy and at peace because I know she's mine. The little breeze is Pauline's own voice. She had a little caressing way, just like the gentlest breeze when it stirs your hair. There's something in everything that brings back Pauline, the beauty of the morning, the song of a bird, or the flash of its wings. The flowers look like she did. So I have not lost her. She's mine more than ever. I have always felt so, but was never quite sure until I went back and saw where they laid her. I knew people think I'm crazy, but I don't care for that. I shall not hate to die. When you get to be as old as I am, child, everything will have a new meaning to you. At last we slowly walked back to the cabin, and at breakfast Zebby told of the damage the storm had done. He was so commonplace that no one ever would have guessed his strange fancy. I shall never forget Zebby as I last saw him. It was the morning we started home. After we left the bench that Zebby lives on, our road wound down into a deeper canyon. Zebby had followed us to where a turn in the canyon should hide us from view. I looked back and saw him standing on the cliffs, high above us, the early morning sun turning his snowing hair to gold, the breeze fingers of Pauline tossing the scanty locks. I shall always remember him so, a living monument to a dead past. Eleanor Stewart. And we will continue this story next Wednesday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.